It's my great pleasure to introduce Phil Long. And, you know, actually there are a couple of Phil Longs in our community. There's the Yale Phil Long, who isn't at Yale anymore. And then there's the MIT Phil Long, who's only partially at MIT. But this is the person that we used to say was the MIT Phil Long, not to be confused with the Yale Phil Long. Phil has been a real pioneer in thinking about instructional technology, open educational resources, digital content in support of instruction, in thinking about how classes can change, how they should change, thinking about hard problems about what works and what's likely to be doable, and what could be real for actual faculty who are trying to teach, as opposed to people who simply speculate about some kind of discontinuous, glorious future that we can never seem to find the path to. It's really rare in my experience to find somebody who combines the visionary piece, the kind of analytic piece about and what is actually going on in the world today, and then also that kind of, you know, base pragmatic sense of frontline teaching and classrooms and courses and students and teachers. That's a really extraordinary mix in my sense. I am particularly delighted that Phil could join us for this meeting. I mentioned he was sort of the former MIT Phil Long. He actually is a professor at the University of Queensland in Australia now. And so he has come a very long way to be with us, and I'm really grateful. And I can't think of a more perfect way to kind of bookend our opening plenary from James Duderstadt, which really took a sort of a highly structural and institutional view of things, with a sort of a look at the ground up changes that are happening, driven by technology and faculty innovation and other activities. So I'm just so pleased you were able to come over for this. Please join me in welcoming Phil Long.
Well, thank you all for hanging out through the last presentation of the session. And I have to say, when I got the note, an invitation from Joan and Cliff earlier on, I jotted down an email with a bunch of scattered thoughts, I know 8 or 9 bullet points of things that were sort of interest and that might be a useful sort of framework to talk about what might be the final presentation. And Joan wrote back, "Yeah, that looks good. And I'd like to see that talk." And I thought, yeah, I'd like to see it too. So what you have here is a relatively raw and scattered set of observations that may or may not hang together in the end. And it's going to be a sort of a journey that starts just who I am. I love the little logo at the top there. We're the only country I know in Australia where we basically eat our national birds. And so one of my graphic designers kind of plays with our logo on the homepage every couple of days, and that was one that came out recently for Australia Day. So I'm going to talk about this, and I'll give you the narrative arc and a few takeaways right away, so if you want to tweet and do other things throughout the talk and then surface periodically, you'll get something at the end. But the narrative arc is going to start with some themes, and if you know me, then you'll know that there'll be some things about emerging technology and such that'll set the stage, but it's not just a recapitulation of that. What I want to try to do is pick out a few things that look at it from a slightly different angle. and then talk about some current teaching and learning issues. And then from there, there's a little bit of in here where I've been really kind of quite captivated lately about what we're understanding about learning and memory, and about cognition and the ways in which we're actually sort of starting to map things out in a more experimental fashion, which I find quite useful and interesting for the teaching and learning side of things. And then close with talking about disruption and opportunities. So that's the general theme here. And I'll start off with the sort of thing that all of you probably are well aware of, which is the Horizon Report, which looks at emerging technologies in teaching, learning, and the creative arts. That's the cover of this last issue. And the executive summary, which lists in the typical fashion a time frame of 1 year or less, which means the things that you see in that first couple of bullets are stuff that's around all over. They just might not be as evenly distributed as we might like. And then the 2 to 3 year horizon with game-based learning and learning analytics, which I'll talk a little bit about, and then the 4 to 5 year. And in the mobile space, the thing I want to bring up is something I think is a little bit different and interesting, because you'll probably recognize, this is Pavra Mistra from the Media Lab, and those of you that follow this have probably seen the Sixth Sense presentations and videos, which cobbled together off-the-shelf parts, which included a Pico projector, a Logitech camera, and a computational device, in this case a mobile phone, and some really creative software. But what he did, and what I want to do here, I don't want the voiceover because I just want to show you some images here. And what he did is he brought, the whole purpose of this was to bring the distributed information and data stores that are out on the web into real life in a timely, situationally appropriate fashion. And so in this case, he wanted to make a phone call. He held up his hand. The gesture brought up the application for the phone, and it projects the phone image onto his hand from the Pico projector, which he can just touch with his fingers to initiate the call. Or projecting, let's a little bit one more visible here, the watch on your wrist when you happen to turn your wrist sideways, and therefore it realizes you want to know what time it is. And of course, looking at a book, it'll automatically pull up the ratings from Amazon that tells you what the authors thought when you're looking at the book, or a newspaper, or the weather map, or in this case, I just missed it, when you're talking to somebody, it'll actually bring up what the search terms are that you found on the web that describe the metadata of that person. And in this case, he's getting an update projected onto his paper ticket of airline traffic. The point of all of this is bringing the digital world and the physical world together, much like one of the presentations earlier in this session looking at AR technologies, augmented reality technologies. And we also talk about mobiles and phones, and that's great, but the thing that's most interesting to me about phones is the fact that they are a remarkable set of instruments. There are some 30 different sensors inside a typical Android phone. Some of them have hygrometers. They all have barometers in them. They have 3 different accelerometers and such. And then you have projects like the FUMF project, which you may know of from the Media Lab at MIT, where they're simply collecting the patterns of these different sensors and then interpreting those patterns to build a database. It's actually an open access, open source database that allows you to marry the patterns that you get from your particular sensors to their translation into physical or other behavioral meanings or in semantic meanings. So you can look at sensors and see, oh, that's the pattern for walking upstairs, or that's the pattern for going downstairs. And you're carrying around in this thing a remarkable instrumentation system that can Bluetooth or email or whatever data to you on a regular basis if you're interested in pursuing that. In the game-based space, the thing that is, I think, interesting is that this is much more being driven outside of the halls of academia. This happens to be a video from NatWest Bank in Australia.
Imagine a place where you can try out property investment before you actually hit the market. A place where you can get a sense of what it's like to invest without the risk. Imagine no longer. This is Investorville.
Woo!
Using actual property data, Investorville will help you learn the basics of investing in property in a fun and friendly environment. You start by choosing your investor profile and organising your pre-approval finance just like a real investor. Then you can search suburbs right across Australia that match your investment goals and budget. Over a simulated 15-year period, you'll have to set rent, decide when to repair or renovate, and deal with events that occur to actual investment properties in real life.
I'll stop that there, but you can see the trend. And they also have AR apps for doing housing evaluations, so you can walk down a street, point your phone at a particular house, and it'll give you what the house sold for in the last sale, and what the school districts are in the area, and things like that. And of course, a little bit of humor. This is a wonderful site for pet adoption, in which you basically upload your image of yourself and the kind of dogs you're interested in, and then it takes and finds the sort of dog you're interested in as closely matched as possible to you, and then the dog sends you an email saying, "Please adopt me." It's actually spurred adoption rather powerfully in this ways, and quite thoughtful. Okay. So learning analytics, I'll just turn to briefly. And first of all, to clarify what I mean by it, I'll take George Siemens' definition. George from Athabasca University defined it as the use of intelligent learner-produced data and analysis models to discover information, social connections, and to predict and advise on learning. The idea clearly here is that we are seeing more and more the interactions with learning objects and learning materials that are digital, and we have the digital footprints of individuals' interactions with them. We have done relatively little to try to model what those interactions are and their consequences when it comes to actual acquisition or demonstration of understanding. Now, one place that's been doing this quite a lot lately, and you'll recognize Saul Kahn there from the Khan Academy, is that in the Khan Academy, one of the things they've been building is a relatively interesting learning analytics back end with some gaming thrown on top with the badges you see there, so that when students achieve particular competencies, meaning a certain number of positive or accurate answers in a row to a question in a particular learning sequence, that data is all trapped along with all the interactions the students have with the material leading up to that. Now, it's also in the world outside of academia. Here you have analytics for your aquarium. In this case, you drop that sensor into the aquarium and then fire up your app, and after a bit of adjusting, it builds a aquarium dashboard so that you can see the status of things like the CO2 dissolution in the water, various particular minerals, and other things to tell you about your fish, and of course it'll tweet it to you to keep you advised about what's going on. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that what this suggests to me is we know more about the fish in our aquariums than the students in our universities, because we're getting real-time updates on that aquarium. So lastly, in this particular emerging area, gesture-based computing, and I just want to note how quickly this has changed. So here you have, from 2002, that little bit in the Minority Report where Tom Cruise, you see all the lights on his fingers entirely for dramatic purpose, had nothing to do with the software. This was developed by both the Media Lab and the researchers at NYU, which later became Perceptive Pixel as a company. And you have this wonderful little interaction where he's moving his hands around, positioning things by the relative depth, and then sliding things off the screen in a minute, whoosh, like that, very dramatically. Very shortly after that, this emerged. Anybody recognize what this is? This is, in fact, an infrared camera version of what happens when you turn your Kinect on for your Xbox, because what you can do next with the Xbox is, of course, connect it up and control things like Google Earth with it. And this is a relatively straightforward sort of thing, and we're starting to see more and more apps that are building these kinds of things in for the purposes of a more human-oriented, physical way of manipulating data on the screen. And I'll continue from there. We're also seeing a trend of massification. That's particularly true in countries like Australia. So I want to give you, I'm not sure how powerfully felt it is here. Throughout the 1990s and through the early 2000s in Australia, there was a government policy that really favored the vet sector, as they call it, which is vocational education and training, over university. The general sense was from the government ministries on down that it was not necessary for a progressive country to have baccalaureate-trained people. Rather, we needed people who were plumbers and who were able to do the things that necessary in a very practical vocational sense, and a few people for the upper side of things. The mantra was pushed more and more back then that the resources boom in the early years, which made Australia the world's dirt pit for energy and resources, was that higher education was an indulgence which reflected parents' status aspirations for their children, but not necessarily an economic or cultural or societal imperative. It wasn't until 2008, that's only 4 years ago, that the Bradley Review reported out that there is in fact a need to reconsider that the knowledge economy, as Jim talked about in the opening of this session, is actually a very powerful and important trend, and we actually have to increase the number of bachelor holders between, well, in the 25 to 34-year-old range from 29%, which is what it was in 2006, to around 40% in 2020. Now, to do that, if we were to build universities to cover that increase, would require us to build about 22 new 15,000-seat universities in that interim. That's not going to happen. And so it puts institutions in an interesting position if they're being asked to do this sort of thing, to either choose increasing quality and selectivity as the number of people seeking entering school increases, over inducting students with, generally speaking, lower scores because you've already skimmed the cream of the crop up to now, and increase substantially those students in that cohort who have never been or have no tradition of having gone to university in their families before. So you have really true first-time students, which puts an enormous, interesting, and stressful set of requirements on the tertiary sector. So what did our institution do at UQ? Well, we turned around and said, right, by 2020, we're going to actually increase our RHD, Research Higher Degree, and coursework graduate students to a combination of 40% of the overall student body, raising it by 20%. So we, as an institution, have sort of adopted the so-called Harvard DNA approach, where we're going to become more elite and more selective in face of this oncoming onslaught and basically tell the government to go stick it. We will see whether that actually survives, since all funding for universities in Australia comes directly from the government. So this is a little bit of a risky strategy. Nevertheless, increasing in that massification space, of course, you're all familiar with the AI course at Stanford. And what caught my attention about this, besides the fact that, of course, 153,000 people signed up for it, and something like 54,000 roughly actually stayed with it to complete it. What's interesting to me is two things. One is, you'll notice in the upper portion there where the arrow points to in partnership with Stanford University. Stanford actually had nothing to do with the course in its early phases of being offered. And only when the numbers of registrations started skyrocketing and essentially going viral did the institution say, wait a minute, we'd really like our name on this. And the other thing in the lower corner at the arrow says .sub. None of the resources to deliver this course had anything to do with Stanford infrastructure. It was entirely delivered by a commodity ISP with software that was entirely written by Sebastian and Peter, the two course leaders, and had no relationship or dependence on the institution at all in its delivery. That tells me that you can do these kinds of courses entirely independent of traditional institutional infrastructure. And increasingly, that becomes a possibility as we're looking ahead. So the other thing in massification is that we can finally do things in the STEM area with distributed and remote labs. And it's been an area certainly that we've been working on for about a decade. This happens to be a radioactivity experiment, and I'll simply play the video briefly. It starts with an animation to show students that what's going to happen when they actually run the experiment. You'll note on the right-hand side there's a research journal where the students are prompted through a set of research questions in a typical discovery cycle kind of approach. And ultimately, after they go through and and play with the video, with the animation, and start to answer some of those questions, the next thing that'll happen is they will be given an opportunity to actually control the device. And this is not a simulation. It is, in fact, a physical device. After they can look up some of the background material and such, then they can pull up an interface that allows them to set up the experiment, change the sensor height and various distances. That's my colleague Mark Schultz at the center. And put in the number of measurement instances that they're going to have, the number of trials, et cetera. And then ultimately, they'll be able to, if they wish, watch the webcam and see the experiment performed, or they can log off at that point and pick up the results in an emailed document to them later. And this is, in fact, the actual hardware that's spinning down to start doing the measurements for them. We ran this experiment in actually a trial kind of context, with one cohort going through the whole thing, including executing the experiment, and another cohort going through the whole thing, except right at the point of actual configuration and hitting submit. They got a data set back from a prior run, and the only difference was the agency of doing it. And we then looked at the scores on the evaluations, the students that submitted their reports, and there was a 19% learning gain difference between those that actually executed the experiment and those that got the data set back. The only difference being the belief that they were actually doing something. Now, we get about 5,000 students a month hitting this from our, this is actually located in Australia, and all of the students using it are in the Midwest of the US, ironically. So it is really, I think, a powerful way to begin to make these kinds of resources available to a large population, since we can support something like, there's only one instrument that's supporting those 5,000 students. So this rate of technology change continues, and it continues to challenge our institutions' ability to adapt and change. But I mentioned earlier, I was interested in what's going on in the cognitive neurophysiological side that's underlying learning that we're starting to get a much better grasp on. And the first thing is, of course, is that learning is the formation and retrieval of memories, principally. And in that case, we understand deeply that there are various kinds of memory, and memory have various kinds of limitations. So consider arithmetic for the moment. Some of you may have seen the Treviso Arithmetic, which is a book that was published in 1478, largely for the merchant class in Venice, which was at that time the dominant commercial and business powerhouse. And merchants needed to quickly and rapidly compute multiplications for business. And so this particular book laid out mechanisms for doing so that recognized very poignantly the limitations that we have in terms of short-term memory. And so you'll see that sort of quadrant laid out there, and there's a little sub-simplification of it here you can do for yourself. If you're multiplying 36 times 92, then you simply multiply 3 times 9, you put the 27 in the upper left box, you do 9 times 6, and you write 54 in the upper right box, 3 times 2, lower left box, 6 times 12, to 2 for 12 in the lower right. And then you draw these vertical, or rather 45-degree angle lines, and simply add it up. So 2 is in the ones place, 10, 11 is in the tens place, carry the 1, 12, 13 in the hundreds place, carry the 1, 3,312 becomes your answer. And that very quickly allows you to go through and do your multiplications in extraordinary efficiency and speed, recognizing the limitations that we all have in short-term memory. Now, short-term memory visually is a similar thing. This is research done in 2005 where they looked at picking out patterns, in this case the patterns of red blocks, with distractors, the patterns of blue blocks. And they can actually measure evoked potentials when in fact you're making that the correct selection of the 4 patterns that you wish, and when you have distractors, how much the correct capability is diminished. And in this particular case, we can essentially remember about up to 5 different pattern sets, and that's it. And as you have distractors put in there, it drops down. And people turn out to fall into those that have high capacity to ignore the distractors and those that don't. So we have short-term working memory have various limitations. Now, we've been using this in various ways poorly over time. We've had viewing and listening places for a long time for the kinds of things of storytelling as opposed to instruction. But then In 1079, Pope Gregory issued his papal decree mandating that cathedral schools instruct the clergy and began the process of lecture for instruction. And I like this image because right in the corner here, you see what even back then was a common phenomenon, right? And we find that in 1791, with the invention of the book technology, Samuel Johnson was quoted as saying, "I've got a strange opinion that everything should be taught by lectures. Now I cannot see that lectures can do so much good as reading the books from which the lectures are taken. Lectures were once useful, but now, when we can all read and books are so numerous, lectures are entirely unnecessary." And in fact, this is a typical class, which we now have managed to amplify with Massification to put hundreds to sleep simultaneously. And there's a reason for that. It took work that Carl Wyman and company have done occasionally. In this particular case, it was a study done in 2005 where they were looking at the ability of students to recall essentially contraintuitive facts. In this case, the sound of a violin is not made by the vibration of the strings, it's made by the vibration of the back of the violin. And many students don't have that understanding at the start. And so they introduce this in a part of a course in physics and then simply ask the question 15 minutes after explicitly explaining this. They put up the multiple choice question, how is the violin sound made? And 84% of them answered, the strings are vibrating, right? And unfortunately, this is a very common phenomenon. Also in that they did a meta-analysis looking at, in this case, a set of courses in the red. There's about 14 there, and I believe 48 representing the green. And the fraction of concepts learned is the learning gains kind of metric in which they sampled the students after lecture, and you can see that the relative learning gains for the green clump is significantly higher than the red clump. And the little diagram in the upper right simply shows a kind of example problem where there's a ball bearing going through a ring, and that opens up, and the student is supposed to predict in what direction the ball bearing emits and continues. Now, it takes a Nobel physicist to get a learning paper in science. And son of a gun, and last year, Wyman and company now at UBC published this little bit, which looked at a large enrollments physics class, a calculus-based physics class. And once again, 800 students in the class, they divided up in sections. One section of about 270 some had a traditional lecture recitation structure with a very well-regarded and highly experienced instructor giving it. And the second one matched that of about 280 some students, matched that slide for slide, PowerPoint for PowerPoint, quiz for quiz for the first 11 weeks. And then in week 11, the so-called treatment group was transformed. They started doing a week's worth of active learning, clickers, concept questions, and student discussion in class. After the week was up, they'd give the test to find out what happens, and lo and behold, there's almost no overlap in the learning gains between the two. Now, you can make there was a lot of discussion in the commentary after this was published about, well, this was not a controlled experiment. They didn't randomly assign the students to sections and all that sort of thing. This is, in fact, a real-world experiment. It, in fact, involved the students that didn't know going into the class this was going to be happening, and they were asked if they would be willing to participate. The sections were whatever the sections were going to be based on the time of day. So I don't think those controlled criticisms about experimental design are particularly salient in this case. What it does tell us is that, in fact, the kind of traditional memory requirements that we already know are difficult to use effectively because of our own limitations apply in spades when it comes to lecture. So we talk about lecture, and we also talk about this host of other pedagogical things. If you talk to people in the education space and learning and pedagogy and the like, they talk about direct instruction, active learning, deliberate practice, guided instruction, and on and on. And one of the problems is that we don't really define what the heck we mean by any of them. We don't apply operational, practical descriptions that describe what these things are, and so it makes it extremely difficult to make heads or tails out of the research that comes out of them. And the result is we have pedagogical models that are in some sense bereft of precision because of that problem. Now, we also have long-term memory that we understand is broken into two parts. And in this particular case, we are starting to understand not only how the long-term memory works, but also actually being able to manipulate it. It's quite remarkable. This is just last year in Science, where they found a particular portion of the hippocampus that's associated with contextual memory formation and identified the actual transcription requirements for a particular gene that allows for and enables the formation of contextual memory and can reliably manipulate and produce that. Short-term memory we know is activity-based, not structural. Long-term memory we're now starting to realize is structural in the result of actual neuronal anatomy changes, and therefore protein synthesis and dendrite reformation and connections. Long-term memory isn't also one thing. It's a long-term memory of explicit things. It is contextual, of place, a name, what you ate, etc. So this is all a contextual set of relationships, not a snapshot. That having been said, there's some just stunning things. This is brand new out of Nature, this about a month ago from Tanagawa's lab at the Pickaware Center at MIT, where they used the latest sort of hot topic technique. Are you familiar or have been seeing papers on optogenetics? Optogenetics is the ability to take a particular fluorescent chemical and attach it to a protein, and then through the uses of a transmission vector like a virus or something like that, inject that particular protein in exactly the space that you'd like it in a gene sequence, and then shine a light on it with a particular nanofrequency, and that frequency will cause that protein to activate and function. So you're actually able to then measure by sticking electrodes into the brain whether or not that particular location that you can activate manually triggers something specific. And in this particular case, he's actually demonstrated the ability to trigger and demonstrate the formation of a fear response in rats, so that where he trains the rats to have them, and then he can turn the light on, and then when the rat is in the context within which they learned that response, they'll hunker down into the prepare for shock kind of position. And if they're not in that context, they don't do it, even though they're triggering the same set of cell patterns, the same in the amygdala in this case. It's just, I think, remarkable. And then you have stuff like this. This is from the Gallant lab at UCB in Berkeley, and they showed students, or subjects, I should say, they were students, hundreds of hours of YouTube videos and then fMRI recordings. And what you see is subjects 1, 2, and 3 in rows, and you see the presentation movie on the top, and you see different movies in the vertical columns that the students all received, and it's cycling through to show you what they showed, and in this case, the fMRI recordings that were transcribed from the brain directly. So what this is actually starting to indicate is that we can, in fact, record directly from the brain the direct images from things like movies. And the only thing that's missing here is resolution. And predictions seem to be at this point that, and this is not a wild prediction, in 5 to 7 years, the resolution will get significantly, several-fold increased. Now, if we can do that, if we can actually record and measure and play back these kinds of things, it raises a whole bunch of interesting questions. Okay. So we see that there is something about how the brain works and how short-term and long-term memory work, and yet when we do put down a memory, we also know it's almost invariably terribly difficult to change it. Now, this is from a video back in 1999. Some of you may have seen it from the Annenberg Foundation. It was from An Invisible Universe, and this shows graduation at MIT and Harvard.
We asked these recent graduates some simple questions in astronomy. Consider, for example, that the causes of the seasons is a topic taught in every standard curriculum.
Okay, I think the seasons happen because as the Earth travels around the sun, it gets nearer to the sun, which produces warmer weather, and gets farther away, which produces colder weather. And
Summa cum laude in physics.
How hot it is or how cold it is at any given time of the year has to do with the closeness of the Earth to the sun during the seasonal periods.
The Earth goes around the sun. And it gets hotter when we get closer to the sun, and it gets colder when we get farther away from the sun.
These graduates, like many of us, think of the Earth's orbit as a highly exaggerated ellipse. Even though the Earth's orbit is very nearly circular, with distance producing virtually no effect on the seasons, we carry with us the strong, incorrect belief that changing distance is responsible for the seasons.
Now, these kids just been through 4 years of some of the best schools on the planet, graduating in physics and various other related disciplines, and yet this is their understanding. It is extremely difficult to dislodge memories that we have made. Now, another thread in this particular story has to do with our own inability to recognize when we don't understand something. This is work from David Dunning. I don't know if you're familiar with his stuff. He's at Cornell. And it's just remarkable stuff. In this case, the title gives it all: Why People Fail to Recognize Their Own Incompetence. And have just extraordinarily robust studies showing that students, individuals with the remarkable ability to think that they know much more than they do and consistently score much more poorly than they have predicted. And it is a consistent finding. It's not only in students, but they went to a gun club and asked people at the gun club about their own weapons that they were firing and how they worked, and had similar findings that the people were very assertive about what they thought they knew, and when tested, they tested pathetically and had no clue that they had done so. Which I think leads to this wonderful little description. They call it the double curse. If people lack the skills to produce correct answers, they are also cursed with an inability to know when their answers, or anyone else's, are right or wrong. Which was summarized by, in short, incompetence means that people cannot successfully complete the task of metacognition. Now, John Cleese actually commented on this.
The problem with people like this is that they are so stupid that they have no idea how stupid they are. You see, if you're very, very stupid, how can you possibly realize that you're very, very stupid? You'd have to be relatively intelligent to realize how stupid you are. There's a wonderful bit of research by a guy called David Dunning at Cornell, who's a friend of mine, I'm proud to say, who's pointed out that in order to know how good you are at something requires exactly the same skills as it does to be good at that thing in the first place, which means, and this is terribly funny, that if you're absolutely no good at something at all, then you lack exactly the skills that you need to know that you're absolutely no good at it. And this explains not just Hollywood, but almost the entirety of Fox News.
Moving right along. We also know that this ability to recall things actually is incredibly important. The practice of retrieval is extremely important. It's one of these things which, remarkably, we don't actually tell our students, or we don't know to tell our students, which may be sadly the case, which basically says that when students are, in fact, studying something, their tendency is to set aside the things that they've learned and concentrate on the things that they haven't yet. So they go through and remember and practice on something, and when they think they've gotten that, they set it aside and go on to something else, which has been shown repeatedly to be exactly the wrong thing to do. If you do that, when it comes time to actually retrieve it for example, a test a week later, the things that you specifically indicated or thought you knew, you do worse on than the things you didn't think you knew. That process of retrieval is, in fact, a process of reconstruction. As we said before, memory is not simply a snapshot. It is, in fact, a set of relational parameters that get constructed every time a memory is recalled. And that process of remembering is a process of that reconstruction. Now, we also know that there are some interesting things that shape that. This is work done by Moser and company, again, relatively recently published in 2011, in which there is a exam and a psychological exam called the theory of intelligence, which allows you to categorize individuals into those with a so-called growth mindset and those with a more restricted mindset. A growth mindset simply means that when you if you make a mistake or when you demonstrate errors in something, you see it as an opportunity to figure out what it is that you did wrong and learn from that, and others who see that as simply a limitation of their ability. And they've actually measured this with evoked response potentials, And they can actually correlate when someone is doing an error trial. There is a particular pattern of evoked response potential which is associated with when a person recognizes their error and is trying to correct it. And they can measure that and find, in fact, that people with growth mindsets have a much greater ability to make those kinds of corrections and adjustments when subsequently tested than those that don't. And finally, we know something about the pattern, not only of study, that is when and the timing of the incidences of study, but also how long you let pass before you do a test or an exam. And in this case, they have plotted a set of data from a series of subjects where they looked at the study gap. That is, I'm studying an hour today and an hour tomorrow and whatever, or certain periods of time between them, and then later on how many days it is before I actually take the test and what the recall rate is from that test. And in the process, it's become very clear that you can actually do well or nearly as well with a relatively long test delay if the right set of study gaps, the right set of pattern for studying over time is accomplished. And begin to plot these kinds of things out. The remarkable thing, and I apologize for the amount of text, but I did want to read this, it's striking how often these strategies differ from conventional instruction and study methods. If educational practices, from textbook layout to ed software, to the study and teaching of strategies used by students and teachers are adjusted to exploit these findings, it ought to be possible to significantly enhance educational and training outcomes. And yet, we haven't. So, once again, going back briefly to the analytics that the Con folks have been putting together, one of the things we know from this, and this is sort of documenting what many of us know with the gut, and it's nice to see it in data, and this is the series of the progressions of students learning over a 90-day period in the Khan Academy system. And basically it shows what is in some sense, in looking at the data, obvious. If you sliced it at the beginning, the students that are at the top that have learned the fastest versus those at the bottom are not at all represented further down the pipe. That depending on when you look at them, their relative rate of performance and their relative ability or your judgment perhaps of their capacity is radically different. They're learning at different rates. Some of them will plateau for long periods of time before they all of a sudden pick up again. Now, this is in contradistinction, of course, to the fact that we teach in fixed 13 or 16-week semesters and have exams at regular periods independent of any of this knowledge. Now, moving to one other area, I'm going to talk about big data. I have to grab my crib sheet here. I don't know if you've seen this work from Michael Snyder. It's just extraordinary stuff. He decided when he joined Stanford's med school to be a sample of one, and to have his blood taken, in which case about 20 blood samples taken once every 2 months while he was healthy, and more frequently when he was ill, virus or cold or something, over a period of 2 years. And then they analyzed something like 4,000 variables from those samples over time. One of the things they discovered quite unexpectedly, because there's nothing in his family history to reflect this, is that he had a gene that suggested a predisposition for type 2 diabetes. And they found, after 2 bouts of colds from getting him from his kids, that he developed diabetes. And they tracked the development of it in his biological samples. I'm sorry about that. In his biological blood samples and assays. On day 301, about 12 days after a viral infection, his glucose regulation appeared to be abnormal. Shortly thereafter, the glucose levels became elevated, prompting him to visit his primary care physician. On day 369, he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. It's the first time that anybody has recorded the development of diabetes in real time through what is effectively the beginning of this quantification of self, which is a phenomenon that's occurring mostly in the health area, but in this case, in a much more interesting way in terms of personal medicine. And they've labeled this integrative personal omics profiling, and from it are starting to understand much more deeply what it is that happens when, in fact, you get various viruses and are challenged and what's happening inside your body, measuring 40,000 variables over a 2-year period. Now, that's an extraordinary thing to have done, but it is a harbinger of what we're going to be able to do more directly in a short period of time. So I want to take all of this and now apply it to a real-world situation in an engineering class that we're working with at UQ. Engineering 1200 is a second semester, first-year engineering course on materials engineering. This is a play that has 2 main acts. Our semesters are 13 weeks long. In the first 6 weeks, we're going to deliver all of the content for the course, and in the second 6 weeks, they're going to be working entirely on build projects. But to do that, we're doing this in a class of some size. I remember the Massification notice earlier. This is a class that's reflective of this.
Means we've got
and I'll turn off the volume because that doesn't need to be there. These are students wandering into it. I have this video because of, we're not at University of New South Wales, but it's the same basic size class to give you an idea. It's a class of about 1,200 students. And this is common for first-year classes in our part of the world. In physics and chemistry and biology, this is normal. 1 instructor, 1,200 students, a handful of TAs. And in this particular case, you get to see the class laid out in front of you. Okay. And I'll just speed it along really briefly. We don't need to see this guy. Well, I guess I can't. And one of the things you can do is you can sort of engage them by having them do the wave, for example, across the class. And when question time comes, we give them pieces of paper and they write questions on paper and fold up paper airplanes and throw them to the front. And we pick up the paper airplanes to answer them. This class has this, we're using this as a narrative. So the class gets together once a week and has this large presentation, a storytelling exercise to contextualize what they're going to be doing for that week. Then we do content delivery. This is the modified version of Blackboard that we're working to develop that puts in videos a la Khan and various other things so that they can use it later for pulling down material when the time comes when they're doing their build projects. Then we have problem-solving groups of about 100, and they're doing things like this. And I want to show you this little vignette because this shows what a problem-solving session can really do. This is Peter Damashkin at MIT at the Teal classroom.
Our inner square, right? Oh, wow. Look at so this is 2 pi m over 4 pi r outer to the 4th minus r inner to the 4th divided by r outer squared minus r inner squared.
Oh, and you count, because you do the difference of squares and cancel those out.
That's it.
Wow.
Okay.
How would you like to have a student say,
Sure.
wow, to a physics problem like that when you were teaching? But that's what you can do in these kinds of 100-student peer kind of oriented problem sessions. And finally, the whole second half of the course is these build projects, where they're going to have to actually build 4 different things, and then at the end of this term, they'll have a contest to see whether or not the things they've built work. Massive experiment. This is one of those resume breakers. It's either going to work wonderfully well, or I'll be looking for you for a job. So what do these examples have in common? I'm wrapping up at this point. This is an example where, like many industries, in this case, there are dozens where disruptive technologies have transformed the business in very, very powerful ways. We're refining the definitions of pedagogical practice, and we're trying to figure out what are the actual activities and the appropriate metadata that really define them, because we haven't done that well. We're looking at reframing the place-based institution, as Jim Duderstadt said at the beginning of this, as a sea of learning options. And I think that's going to be one of the most powerful things coming along. I'm very interested in the badging activities that are happening, in particular the industry support that seems to be behind them, because they open up all kinds of possibilities. When certification is no longer the hegemony of higher education institutions, all bets are off from my perspective. And technology trends tend to separate things which were previously inseparable. And in so doing, learning institutions will find their coherence challenged. If we can, in fact, do things in different places and in different ways, why do we need these spaces as we have them today? In many reasons, the purpose that we have built them and the reason we've structured them is because we needed a way to stuff things down people's ears to understand something in a particular context. And if that's no longer a meaningful way of approaching it, then the whole notion of why we built them and the structure that they have is a question. And that means places like this, like your organization, like CNI, actually are, in a sense, para-institutional partnerships. They're the paradata of organization, because they bring together these memes and these ideas and these threads across institutions, which I think are going to be increasingly challenged to do things entirely on their own or with selected local partners. And in effect, provides an institutional or a glue that is built around the data and the ideas and the underlying scholarship that you're trying to get at. When we have this research on disentangling representation from learning, the real question that starts to become, are we what we remember, and can we do what we remember? Because we may be able to transport from one place to one person to another an entirely intact set of memories. But does that mean we can do what those memories suggest? And I return back for just a second to this little clip that shows
of fMRI data.
The presented
so
clip
close.
on the left and the reconstructed clip on the right. So that was a couple months ago. So in my perspective, it's a really interesting case of technology disintermediating, separating things that were once inseparable. And I think it's an issue that we're going to have to present and deal with going forward. And I thank you for the time this afternoon to talk about it. The floor is yours. Any questions? I'm between you and your flight home, I know. Yes?
It was interesting you talked about technology separating things, where we often think of technology integrating what we do. So that's an interesting disparity that I hadn't thought about, that it might take us apart rather than allow us to stay together better. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, or just say everything you want to say?
I think it's one of the things that one of the things that technology has allowed, essentially, is the ability to take things that were once just simply joined. I mean, take, for example, the whole state of affairs that the publishing industry is in. The idea that, that publishing was devised and the economic patterns around it that emerged, in part were because the process of publication, the technology that was available, had a particular characteristic, both in an economic sense, a fiscal sense, but also a physical sense. Now that we have separated that ability to represent things from that structure, it has thrown the business model into disarray. And I think it's one of the reasons why there's a great deal of uncertainty in that space going forward. And we see it in lots of other industries. It is something that, as, again, Jim Duderstadt mentioned at the beginning, along with the Catholic Church, universities are one of the most conservative, sustaining, unchanging institutions on the planet. And that has certain value to it, because if it varied all over the place with whatever current whim was out there, we would have some interesting consequences. So in one sense, institutions are, in fact, a vessel that sort of transmits from one generation to the next a corpus of understanding and social knowledge and content knowledge. At the same time, once we start to use these technologies in different ways and can begin to partition things, I think it starts to question then the original structures that we have. And I think institutions, particularly those, maybe not so much amongst the core membership of an organization like this, but I think those institutions at the sort of next tier down are going to be in a world of uncertainty as things go forward, particularly with the kinds of deep interest that the for-profits have in making learning effective and efficient and cheap.
So Clayton Christensen has predicted in Disrupting Class that by 2019, 50% of high school courses will be taught outside the classroom. Could you comment on your opinion of his timing and results?
Crystal balls are always wonderful. I think that there is every reason to believe, I'm not sure whether that the high school market's the first place I would have selected for that. But I certainly think it's the case that in these kinds of large lectures, if we were doing that large lecture of the sort that I showed you as lecture, as opposed to as a storytelling exercise, then we would have what I think Sherry Turkle calls being alone together. We would be having people gathered in one physical place and having nothing essentially to do with one another while they're there. So in that case, it seems to me distance learning and that in that classroom, that's the same thing. It's just, you would actually be better off watching the video of the class in that space than you would probably listening to it. You'd probably see it better. Yes, I think that there will be a rise in the choice, both in terms of the ability to choose when and where and what context you have the opportunity to have that particular form of instruction. And it will be, I think, those institutions that figure out the so-called hybrid course structures, that'll be the ones that'll have significant weight going forward. Because I personally have always grown up in an institution that was deeply place-based. I think the value of bumping into one another is one of the prime reasons for why we have these institutions. It is, frankly, why things like the attempt that the Media Lab made several years ago to franchise itself in different parts of the world failed miserably, because you can't transport that sort of special interaction that happens in Cambridge necessarily to India or other cultures. There's something different that's going on. But we haven't yet really identified carefully what the nature of that is and where it applies. Any other questions? I see Cliff.
Okay. I've got there are probably two questions in here, but they sort of fit together. So you pointed out some of this amazing biology and neuroscience that's emerging, that's starting to help us to really understand how memory works and different kinds of memory. It really is kind of amazing to see them begin to unravel this. I think that we've got a very dodgy kind of issue about how memory relates to knowledge. And it shows up in trying to understand where this work plays. It also shows up in questions about, what does it mean to really know a subject in a world of always-on wireless and, all of the resources of the net being one click away. So that's one thing I'd like you to maybe speculate a little bit about for us. But then the other one I'd like to tee up behind that is, as we understand these biological mechanisms, the next obvious thing to do is intervene in them. And, we're already seeing a certain amount of, for example, use of drugs that I think mostly are prescribed for attention disorder being used as aids for memorization or absorbing collections of material. What happens when we get learning drugs? I mean, are we going to give drug tests before passing out Nobel Prizes? How does this play out? This is something I actually, worry about a little bit in odd moments. One can imagine,
But take another pill.
Corporations wanting, to ensure that their people are really sharp on the trading desk. And if you want to work the trading desk, here's your prescription. Mm-hmm. Would you speculate a little bit about that too?
Well, in reverse order. I mean, it's to some extent, it's kind of like, one might make the analogy, it's kind of like saying, when we're having our exams today, please deposit your calculators and computers at the door. I want you to do this as raw as possible with no aids. Now, in the case of neurochemical agents, I mean, that's just another technology aid in some sense. It's a actual current consideration and argument, frankly, in competitive sport, right? So why should somebody, for example, where we know we can do in bicycling, we can increase oxygen capacity and consumption with some of the urotherapeutic drugs, and if everybody can do that, and there's no necessarily in that particular case known significant side effects, why not? I mean, what's the heroic value there in being en natural in this context when what you're doing is in fact simply augmenting what is? So I think there is a series of issues that now are more in the ethical domain than in the practical domain, because I think you could make an argument from a practical sense in a number of ways, all of which will be coherent and all of which would be logical. But then I think we have to step back from that and say, what is it that we want to be? And that I think is a separate and important question, which, like the earlier comment about technology dividing things, is a question that didn't get asked before because we never were in the position to need to ask it. But now the technology is giving us this opportunity to ask it, and we should probably take it up. When it comes to the earlier question, I think in terms of what do we do or how do we intervene in the knowledge of this? I mean, I do think that there are possible opportunities for looking at patterns that might be, I mean, we've got a couple in the lab. You've probably seen them. The little things that look like headphones, except instead of have the earphones have these little metal things on them, and there's a thing that comes around the point and punches right to your forehead. They're EKG, portable EKG devices that give you 20 channels of EKG that you could Bluetooth out to your laptop. And people are building game interfaces. That's what's driving it. Building game interfaces so that you can control your various games by thinking about them. But there's no reason to think that with a little bit more sophistication and understanding, we might be able to look at diagnostic characteristics of people that are having less success in particular kinds of abstract activity from some pattern. I mean, that's a gross exaggeration, and please understand that I realize how crude that kind of an analogy is, but I think it serves the purpose of allowing us to think about what sorts of interventions we might actually want. I mean, the biggest problem, and one of the things I think I'm most positive about, unlike some of my colleagues when it comes to learning analytics, is that we know that most classes, at least particularly as they massify to the point that we have in Australia, we don't give feedback that's of any value at all. We can't, by and large. By the time we finish the grading of a quiz, 2 weeks have passed. It's useless. The only reason we're grading it is because we're reporting up, not because we're helping students who are learning in the classroom. And so the promise of being able to do predictive modeling when it comes to learning patterns and from analytics is to be able to actually provide more contiguous response. And that we know matters. So from my perspective, that's a really powerful reason to want to do this, with all of the concerns that are inherent in that about having too much data about individuals that could be used in a way that we would perhaps not like. But I think the upsides are there, and we're not going to get away from these increasing demands for this kind of learning in institutional contexts. I can't see class sizes dropping anytime soon, at least in our part of the world. Any other questions? One more.
So, if you have a magic wand as a university president, what would you do?
If I had to what?
Magic wand. You're the university president.
Right.
You're in charge. What would you do to change things?
Oh, how would I change things if I were God?
Yeah.
Gee, I think about this all the time. Well, a couple of things. One is that I happen to think that the whole credit hour seat time metric is bankrupt, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better. I understand the need for some scheduling and regularity for logistical purposes and for life, for the people who are involved in the process of the scholarly enterprise. So I'm not suggesting that I would simply dismiss the semester, but I am suggesting that I would think about it very differently. Have a course for a period of time, and try to go through the material with an emphasis on actual doing and hands-on engagement. As much as physically possible, and then at the end of that period of time, I would probably schedule a 2 or 3 week intensive where those people who didn't do as well as we thought they could have got a chance to have intensive opportunity to bring themselves back up again and to sort of narrow the learning variance that naturally occurs over the course of the semester, and then restart in the next course once they have demonstrated in that intensive interregnum period that they have gained enough of the competency necessary to do that next course. And if they haven't, then I would leave them to do it again. I think this notion that that graduation is more a matter of duration and the ability to endure, as opposed to the ability to learn, is something that is deeply dysfunctional about our current system. And yet, we're not willing to make the hard decisions about that. And I know in our institution, I suspect in most, the single most difficult thing to deal with is the scheduling software for classes. If we could fix that and allow for greater flexibility in that context, we would make a huge difference in the learning gains at our institutions. So if I were in the opportunity to restructure things, the first thing I would do is take courses, have them for a nominal period of time, and then intercede a duration of intensive opportunity for those that needed it. And for those that didn't, they could either do nothing, go to the beach, or they could do something entirely lateral that pursued an interest that they had. And then reconvene for the next session once the competency is developed. But until we get into a more competency-based system, I think we've got a real problem. I'll call it a wrap. Thank you very much.
Just an amazing tour through all of the worlds of learning and teaching and biology and technology. That was fabulous. Thank you. And safe travels all. We're adjourned. Thank you for coming.